But for the great majority of Germans, the end of the Third Reich probably came as a welcome relief. The Nazi Party crumbled. There was no serious attempt to revive it. Goebbels tried before his death to create a resistance movement, which he called the Werewolf, but it had virtually no supporters. Everywhere in Europe occupied by the Germans, resistance movements had emerged. But apart from in Serbia, they'd only emerged when it became clear that the Germans were not going to win the war. In the years of the greatest triumphs, from 1939 through to the end of 1941, nobody much in Europe saw the point of restarting a resistance movement. In Germany, after the end of the war, it was even clearer that the Allies had won a crushing victory and that resistance was pointless. Germany had been almost completely destroyed. Many people blamed Hitler for continuing to fight to the end instead of surrendering. Belief in him had cemented the regime together, bound the people to it. Once he was dead, many no longer saw anything to fight for. Nazism had pumped out propaganda all along to the effect that might was right, the spoils went to the victor, winner takes all. And now such beliefs, of course, turned back on the Third Reich itself as it collapsed more utterly and completely than any previous regime in German history. And finally, the Allied occupation was so comprehensive and in such overwhelming strength that the prospects of a successful resistance, even by those remaining Nazi fanatics who contemplated it, were virtually nil. So in retrospect, it's not surprising. What's surprising really is not that Germany lost the war, but that the Third Reich was so successful in its early years. It was better prepared than its enemies. It beat them with novel military tactics that they were slow to learn how to counter. It had surprise on its side and a good deal of luck. Its enemies were divided, confused, and poorly coordinated. But Germany lacked the economic resources to fight against the British Empire, the Soviet Union, and the United States of America combined. Even when it acquired the advanced economies of Western Europe and the grain reserves of the Ukraine, it squandered these by its brutal policies of exploitation. I suppose it's futile in the end to ask what might have happened had things been different, if Hitler had not invaded the Soviet Union, or if he'd not declared war on the United States, or if Britain had signed a separate peace, or if the Nazis had called a halt to the war when they were winning. None of these things, in fact, was a realistic prospect. Nazism was not a rational ideology of realpolitik and power politics. It was limitless in its aim of world domination, its doctrine of perpetual war and conflict. Without bounds in its loathing and contempt for Jews, Slavs, and others it regarded as racial enemies or inferiors, unbridled in its glorification of violence and its willingness to use it, whatever the cost. And at the end, indeed, Nazism left nothing but destruction. The cost of the war was enormous. More than 5 million Germans in the armed forces died, another 500,000 civilians. 11 million Germans fled or were expelled from Eastern Europe. According to its own estimates, the Red Army lost 11 million men. Other estimates give a figure more than twice that. The Russians lost 100,000 aircraft, 300,000 artillery pieces, nearly 100,000 tanks and self-propelled guns. The cost in material was not just huge to Germany and German armed forces, also to the Soviets. 6 million Jews were killed, many thousands of other minorities, including gypsies, homosexuals, so-called asocials and deviants, the mentally ill and the handicapped, 200,000 in Germany alone. Millions of civilians perished from massacres, shootings, starvation, disease in Greece, Serbia, Croatia, and Eastern Europe. The physical destruction of towns and cities across Central and Eastern Europe took many years to make good. The Allied occupation of Germany lasted in effect for nearly half a century, until 1990. It began with a massive program of denazification and war crimes trials, which for all their inadequacies and imperfections can be seen in retrospect to have been fairly successful. Experience of Nazism and war destroyed completely the old traditions of German nationalism, as well as overcoming the legacy of class conflict that had played such a baleful part in bringing the Nazis to power. There's been no revival of Nazism except on the outer fringes of politics. There'll be no Fourth Reich. Fascism and anti-Semitism, beyond them racism more generally, have been heavily discredited by the experience of the Third Reich. The Second World War changed Germany and the Germans forever. But, of course, it also changed the world. Nearly 70 years on, we still live in its shadow, even if it is in many ways more subtle and less obvious than it was half a century ago. Thank you very much.